All right, we're going to solve quadratics by factoring. So when we're solving the quadratic, we have to say what our variable, in this case x, is actually equal to. And because it's a quadratic, we're actually going to have two different values that it equals. We have x plus 1 multiplied by x plus 3, and it's set equal to 0. This one's already factored for us, but in order to solve for this quadratic, you're going to take each set of parentheses and set them both equal to 0 and just solve for x. So in this case, we have x plus 1 in the first set of parentheses is equal to 0, and x plus 3 is equal to 0. Now we're just going to solve for x. Remember, to get x by itself, do the opposite operation to both sides of the equal sign. So opposite of plus 1 is minus 1 to both sides. 1 minus 1 is 0. So x is equal to negative 1. And over here, we're going to subtract 3 from both sides. X is equal to negative 3. So here are our answers. Okay, so that one was really simple because it was already factored. But in most cases, you're going to have to factor it first and then find the answer. In this one, we can figure out what we add together to equal negative 2 and multiply together to equal negative 8. We know one's positive, one's negative. Larger one's negative because when they add, they equal a negative. So I'm going to say negative 4 times positive 2. Okay, so this tells me what we break this side down. We have x minus 4 times x plus 2 is equal to 0. So now the next step you have to solve. So a common mistake is just to factor and forget that you actually have to solve. So you're going to take each set of parentheses, set them equal to 0. X minus 4 equals 0, and x plus 2 equals 0. Just solve. I'm going to add 4 to both sides. X equals positive 4. Over here, subtract 2 from both sides, and x is equal to negative 2. So here are my answers. All right, so that one was kind of simple. We're going to get a little more complex on this one. Well, before I even start factoring, I know that 2, 8, and 8 are all divisible by 2, so I'm going to factor out 2. 2x squared divided by 2 is x squared, plus 8x divided by 2 is 4x, plus 8 divided by 2 is 4, set that equal to 0. All right, so I have 2 on the outside times, I have to figure out what I'm going to break this down to. So I know I have to figure out what I add together to equal 4 and what I multiply together to equal 4. Well, 2 and 2. So that means this is x plus 2 times x plus 2 equals 0. So that's what inside the parentheses breaks down to. Okay, now the next step. I need to solve. This 2 that's multiplied on the outside, it doesn't have a variable x, so I'm just going to basically ignore it right now. I'm going to solve for x in my two parentheses. So here we have x plus 2 equals 0, and we have x plus 2 equals 0. Well, if I subtract 2 from both sides, I get x equals negative 2, and here if I subtract 2 from both sides, I get x equals negative 2. So there's technically one answer, x equals negative 2, because these are the same thing. I could have rewritten this as 2 times x plus 2 squared equals 0 and just solve for x plus 2 because I know there's 2 of them multiplied by themselves. That's why it's x plus 2 squared. You're going to get the same answer. So you just have to write x equals negative 2. Okay. On this one, I can't factor anything out. I don't have a number that I can factor out. and my x squared value is multiplied by a number. So this one's the one that's a little more complicated. To figure out what I add together to equal, remember this x, there's 1x, so to equal 1, multiply together to equal 4 times negative 3 is negative 12. So one's positive, one's negative to get a negative when multiplied, and added together is a positive, so the larger one's positive. So I'm going to say positive 4 and negative 3 works. All right, so that's what I use to break down that middle term. I bring down the 4x squared plus 4x plus negative 3x minus 3 is equal to 0. Put parentheses around the first two, last two terms, and from the first I know I can factor out 4x, and I'm left with x plus 1, plus here I can factor out, I need these parentheses to be the same. So I need to factor out a negative, and I can factor out negative 3 times negative 3x divided by negative 3 is x. Negative 3 divided by negative 3 is positive 1 equals 0. Okay, so I'm going to factor out the greatest common factor, which is x plus 1, times what's left over, 4x minus 3. Set that equal to 0. All right, so now I have to solve. So I'm going to set what's inside the parenthesis equal to 0. I have x plus 1 equals 0 and 4x minus 3 equals 0. Okay, I'm going to solve each for x. This one I'm going to subtract 1 on both sides, so x equals 0 minus 1 is negative 1. This one's a little more complicated. I'm going to add 3 to both sides. I get 4x equals 3. Here 4 is being multiplied by x. Opposite is to divide by 4 on both sides. 4 divided by 4 is 1. So x equals 3/4. Leave it as a fraction. You could write 0.75, but x is equal to negative 1 and positive 3/4. All right, so I'm going to have you go ahead and try 4 problems just like those. Don't forget, after you factor, you have to actually solve for x. And come back when you're ready for the answers. All right, this first one's pretty easy. X minus 2 equals 0 and x plus 5 equals 0. I'm going to add 2 to both sides of the equal sign and get x equals positive 2. And subtract 5 from both sides and I get x equals negative 5. All right, in the second one, to figure out what adds together to equal 2 and what I multiply together to equal negative 63. Well, I'm going to say, I know 9 times 7 is 63, and I have to have one of them negative, and the larger one has to be a positive to add together to equal a positive value. So I'm going to say positive 9 and negative 7. So we have x plus 9 times x minus 7 is equal to 0. Now I'm going to solve for x. X plus 9 equals 0 and x minus 7 equals 0. Here subtract 9 from both sides and x equals negative 9. And add 7 to both sides and x is equal to positive 7. All right, last two. On this one, we can factor out a 3. So I'm left with x squared minus 10x plus 25 is equal to 0. Figure out what I add together to equal negative 10, multiply together to equal 25. So in this case, we have 5 and 5, and they're both negative. Negative 5 times negative 5, negative 5 plus negative 5 works. So I have 3 outside times x minus 5 times x minus 5. That's equal to 0, but it's x minus 5 times itself. So this is the same thing as 3 times x minus 5 squared equals 0, because I don't really want to solve for both because I'm going to get the same answer anyways. I'm just going to set x minus 5 equal to 0. I don't set the 3 equal to 0 because, well, that really doesn't mean anything. I don't have a variable x there. I'm going to add 5 to both sides, and x is equal to positive 5. All right, last one. I have to figure out what I add together to equal negative 3, multiply together to equal 2 times negative 2 is negative 4. So in this case, we're going to go with, let's see, 2 times, so we have negative 4 and positive 1 work. And that helps me break down that middle term. All right, so we have 2x squared minus 4x plus 1x minus 2 equals 0. Put my parentheses around my first two, and then my last two terms. First two I can factor out a 2x. I'm left with x minus 2 plus, I can't factor anything out, but I have to factor something out, so I just factor out 1. So you can always factor out 1 from anything. I'm left with x minus 2 because it just stays the same. All right. Greatest common factor is x minus 2. Factor it out. And what are we left with? 2x plus 1 equals 0. Solve for x. X minus 2 equals 0, and 2x plus 1 equals 0. Just set them both equal to 0. Solve. I'm going to add 2 to both sides, and x equals 2. And here I have to subtract 1 from both sides. We have 2x equals negative 1. Divide both sides by 2, and x is equal to negative 1/2. Hopefully you were able to solve those quadratics with factoring.